I don't think I need to specially talk about our presenters today. Darko Suvin, very big name in utopian studies, and yes, that was a modest nod. And Rafaella Baccolini, professor at the University of Bologna. So Darko, the podium is yours.
Let's see whether this works. Oh my God, it does. Okay. I have 3 parts, of which part 2 is, together with footnotes to all 3 parts, is available online on the site of Society of Utopian Studies. So you shall hear part 1 and part 3. Part 1, we in today's Capitalocene. Is the voice all right? Yeah. In the introduction to the 2015 reprint of her classical partial visions, Angelika Bammer cites the pithy injunction of the American poet and feminist thinker Adrienne Rich. This means, quote, unquote, "We need to imagine a world in which every woman is the presiding genius of her own body. In such a world, women will truly create new life, bringing forth the visions and the thinking necessary to sustain, console, and alter human existence. Sexuality, politics, intelligence, power, motherhood, work, community, intimacy will develop new meaning. Thinking itself will be transformed." Bammer goes on to cite Rich's early and thus optimistic, "We stream into the unfinished, the unbegun, the possible." To these 2 quotes, I can only add every male plus whatever other intergenders you care to add. Based on sustaining, consoling, and radically altering the present dire state of human existence, I'm led in this part 1 to 2 sets of arguments. Where are we in general, and what are we here represented perhaps doing wrong? You will, I trust, realize that nobody can in 50 minutes even approach a full listing of the problems I see facing us. What I can give are samples, perhaps representative insofar as the part speaks the whole. 1.1, where are we, the Capitalocene? Thus, to begin with, let us cognize. What is the geologically effective age of Capitalocene whose bitter taste batters our days and invades our nights? It is the epoch of huge and extreme plutocracy, where 1% of the world population appropriates 70% of the riches and enforces it first by high-tech mass murders. NATO military budget for 2019 is planned at $4 billion per day. And second, by fear-mongering to keep the huge majority of losers at bay. In this class warfare from above, about 2.5 billion people, the global reserve army of unemployed, vulnerably employed, and economically inactive, struggle today to survive, while more than half of them live in the most abject poverty, more or less quickly dying of hunger and attendant diseases. If we add hydra-headed marginalization and exclusion, as well as the slow structural violence caused by destruction of environment, deforestation, oil spills, and the aftermath of war, this impacts almost everybody. Economic growth benefits only the rich at the expense of everybody else, especially the poor and the powerless in this generation and the future. Capitalism is globally pursuing a cheap labor economy on the one hand, and the search for new consumer markets on the other. The former undermines the latter. It does not work for the great majority of people, us workers who live from our physical and intellectual work. The capitalist economy jettisons humanity in all its senses, civilized behavior, interests of people, and even their bodies. I shall here insist only on 2 foci of the perfectly sinful Capitalocene: war and ecocide. War. The Keynesian welfare state finally succeeded only in tandem with military Keynesianism. the heavy rearmament that in the 1930s, 40s primed the pump of business upswing and remained the precondition of a relative affluence. And its price was the Nazi regime, high Stalinism, and the Second World War. Under the Bush Jr. administration, war expenses were $1,000 million per year. As for refurbished 2.0 fascism, it is doing very well almost everywhere, thank you. Clearly, war plays a structurally essential role in all monopoly capitalism. The ratio of military to civilian casualties in wars during the 20th century has progressed to 8 civilians killed for each combatant. And the mass casualties have mainly been the poor, the women, the uppity middle states, and the colored. Continuous warfare has never ceased under capitalism, which could not climb out of economic depressions without huge military spending. Between 1945 and 93, where I have data, around 60 wars have raged, killing more people than in World War II. The political fallout is the spread of military rule that subordinates the civil society to its barbarity even in times of official peace. Armaments commodities are since World War II not only the source of greatest extra profit, but a system pillar of capitalism because of their uniquely high value-added price, their especially rapid rate of obsolescence and turnover, the monopoly or semi-monopoly position of their manufacturers, and the large-scale and secure financing of military research, production, and of massive cost overruns. By the time of the first Gulf War, world spending for military purposes was between $2 and $2.5 billion US dollars daily. More than half of it attributable to the USA, and today it is way higher. That was, 18 years ago, something. The tens of millions of dead in the 2 world wars brought about tens of trillions of profitable investments in the huge reconstructions of destroyed homes and industries and ongoing rearmament. So the ratio is $1 million or more per dead body. 1/4 of the public monies which are expended on weapons commodities would eradicate poverty, homelessness, and illiteracy, as well as pay for the cleanup of all our major environmental pollution. I could and should go on about migrants and social justice, but can here only continue about the theme of this conference, climate and ecocide. The Capitalocene does not work for our ecological balance, sorely upset by overconsumption of energy. To the contrary, to prevent collapse, we need a steady-state economy with growth resulting from efficiency. Capitalism uses nature as dead matter to make more dead matter, rather than as a permanently active ensemble of new potencies and potentialities. A UN summary for policymakers of the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, sorry, it's their title, not mine, was just published on May 6, compiled by hundreds of experts from 50 countries. It found 3/4 of the terrestrial environment has been severely altered. More than 40% of amphibian species and 680 vertebrate species have been driven to extinction. In the oceans, almost 1/3 of the reef-forming corals and more than 1/3 of marine mammals are on the edge of extinction. In some, 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many in coming years or at most decades. This report identifies 2 main and related reasons for this catastrophe. In diplomatic UN lingo, the current limited paradigm of economic growth and climate change. In other words, corporate capitalism's reliance on fossil fuel is what has ruined the climate and mainly led to global warming. Also in August 2018, 6 Finnish academics released their background paper for the chapter on UN Global Sustainable Development Report called Transformation, the Economy, which will be released later this year. They find that massive changes are needed in the very design of our societies to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050, which obviously is not going to happen. Quote, market-based action will not suffice even with a high carbon price. In other words, capitalism cannot solve the mass extinction of species and climate change with ocean levels rising by meters or possibly dozens of meters soon, the greatest since the dinosaurs. And of course, the most interesting piece of writing, Stan Robinson's still optimistic SF novel, New York 2140, has been cited here abundantly, much too optimistic, I think. Quite different, but also the best thing written about, I mean. Quite different ways to manage life on the planet must be adopted and enforced. Resources for this are available even if politically taboo. Tens of billions of dollars in subsidies given to fossil fuel firms and agribusinesses that lead humanity towards annihilation. Tens of trillions of dollars in tax havens. If this could be tapped, it would be sufficient to reconfigure energy, transport, housing, and food systems. Both these UN reports are, of course, professionally forbidden to totalize a name, and I shall return to these categories. But the conclusion to be drawn from them is that Capitalocene is total, not only proudly global, but also instantaneous and capillary. We need to insist on equally totalizing eco-utopian thought as addressed so persuasively yesterday by Lisa Garforth. 1.2, what may we be doing wrong? To narrow the focus to our professional affairs, yet within the above general context that shapes us all, I have quite impressionistically two main beefs against what appears a strong tendency in much important utopology of the last decade or two. I begin with an incident that shocked me and go on with a plea following from a Yiddish anecdote. My example stems from a large exhibition called Utopia at the New York Public Library and the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, I believe in 2001, for which some of us were asked to supply a short text online. I did so too, but now I was not very thrilled with the questions, let me say. But now I find that the exhibition carried photos, and I quote, of an Israeli kibbutz and a Nazi concentration camp as if each represented a viable utopia. If this quote from Russell Jacoby is correct, who says he has seen it, this is a grievous and insulting error, and I would rue my participation. As we ought to know, the kibbutzim, where a number of my friends lived for a brief time or permanently, were a sterling example of egalitarian and non-state communism, and were logically stifled by the surge of capitalism and militarism in Israel. To couple them with Nazism is an example of the deep wrongness of the totalitarianism concept. Since I was as a child told I was Jewish, though this didn't mean much to me, but it meant a lot to Hitler, who wanted me dead at age 11 and was foiled by my very clever mother and the help of a sterling communist called Tito, I will introduce my focus with the Yiddish anecdote. A new rabbi comes to a Midwest US community. After the first Sabbath service, an enthused member of the community comes to him and says, Rabbi, everything you did today was great. It was wonderful to have you, but tell me, how come a Jewish rabbi is called Sean Ferguson? And he says, well, you know, I came as a little child to Ellis Island with my parents, and the rule was that each of us has to go to the examiner separately. You cannot go with your parents. So they told me, your name is Yitzhak Katzenellenbogen, and don't forget it, and go there and tell them so. And when I came, this was, two hours later, it was hot, tears running my poor 4-year-old face and trying valiantly not to sob, and he asked me, so what's your name? And I said, Sean Ferguson. I have already I have already forgotten it. So he wrote Sean Ferguson. So, lest we forget, like poor Yitzhak, here is what my beefs are against. There are two. Number one, first, the pseudo-professional de facto censorship or Denkverbot against total and totality, crudely identified with the Cold War notion of totalitarianism, anyway outdated and abandoned by most scholarship. We cannot analyze anything, I contend, unless it's understood as a provisionally closed structure for given purposes. No doubt, the suffering and degradation of millions from world wars and economic depressions, as well as Dachau, Kolyma, and Abu Ghraib, to those bombed out today all over West Asia, they remain and must be taken most seriously as our measuring rods. I myself, whose grandfather and grandmother plus dozens of further relatives were butchered at Auschwitz and Jasenovac, have taken anti-fascist prevention of such suffering and bestiality as the ground base for my life's work. But we can for no cause abdicate from the disalienating dialectics of weighing the pros and cons, for we would degrade both our memories and ourselves should we replicate the butcher's horizons. Surely we should backstage say fascist rants against liberty, equality, and the pursuit of both individual and collective happiness. But even there one should be guarded. I would not like to be without some passages from Pound's Pisan Cantos, or to return to utopias from Junger's On Marble Cliffs, and even the violent and genocidal racism of Heinlein's Farnham's Freehold and Starship Troopers must be weighed in a balance with his brilliant New Deal beginnings. There I would be near to Orwell, who utterly condemned Ezra Pound as a fascist, a war criminal, and the most foul anti-Semite and racialist, while still affirming his poetry merits a prize. And when we consider the great Leninian season of Russia and many other places beginning in, say, 1917-28, and ranging, for example, from Bloch, Zamyatin, Mayakovsky, Pasternak, and Platonov to Brecht, then what Bakhtin called monophonic, and I would call pseudo-liberal accounts of the contradictorily rich and stunted communist polyphony of those times are quite untenable. As Darren Webb reminded us, quote, anyone reading the utopian writings of Charles Fourier, William Morris, or Ursula Le Guin will agree that the good can accommodate difference, unquote. Conclusion. It's better to refute than to ignore, for this means articulating your own presuppositions. My second beef is against a denial and foreclosure, or more hypocritically and insidiously erasure of great ancestors in philosophy, which asks, what are we and how are we to live? And particularly in epistemology, which asks, how do we know what we think we know? Of course, in a way, the more the merrier, and I really should but cannot here go back to the greatest of our ancestors, Marx, Diderot, Rousseau, Aristotle. However, to sideline, for example, Ernst Bloch, Frederick Jameson, or Raymond Williams will much help the desertification of utopian studies into a wasteland of unargued presupposition plus empirical data. This also means castrating Thomas More's great invention, at the same time as Machiavelli, of conceiving society as a holistic system. Not to speak of his applying communism for the first time in history to a whole population instead of an elite. A conclusion. As several famous people have said, whoever does not want to learn from history is condemned to relive it. And in our days, this is the clearly open path to racist and macho fascism 2.0. With this in mind, the rest of the keynote will deal with anti-utopia, leaving totally out a long analysis of Orwell's 1984 and consigning to the handout a brief general discussion of method I found useful. So, second part, what existential anti-utopia means for us. It has, I think, 3 or 4 sections. On theory, utopia and event of a mega-novum, the what? First of all, history, advent of an alternative totality. I agree with Ruth Levitas. Utopia is born out of a conviction and two questions. The conviction is, it doesn't have to be like this. The questions are, how then should we live, and how can that be? Unquote. It is of utmost significance that in the Renaissance, utopianism underwent a sea change from Platonic philosophical argument and blueprint, and then Augustinian theological devaluation of mundane existence, to a narrative genre. Within the belly of the new, increasingly totalizing but dynamic Leviathan, bourgeois democratic and, if you wish, capitalist storytelling, that is the imagination of alternative actions by self-appointed agents in an alternative possible world, developed a key novum with two aspects. The first aspect was the freedom inherent in a relatively wide, eventually mass reading, from the very beginning structured as a more or less free market competition for the reader's attention and choice. This was accompanied by a rise of published utopian items in a generally faster society. On the downside, this was always for books, countered by illiteracy, misery, and the repression of publishing in circulation down to Nazi book burning, Stalinist censorship, and post-1989 book destructions. As an example, the state-ordered mass book destruction in Croatian is documented in a book by Lešaja, but is surely not isolated. And for mass media, this was countered by high costs, oligopoly, and severe top-down control in TV and movies, or whatever is the frontline medium, video, etc. The second aspect was a flexible use of narrative as cognitive means to convey a thicker overview of life and its experience with, against, and in lieu of Leviathan. It amalgamated notionality and sensual evidence centered on deputized protagonists moving and learning in realistic space-time. From Thomas More on, all utopianism reposes, to my mind, on two central cognate imaginative activities and procedures: map-making and naming. Utopianism is a space-creating machine, inconceivable before the space-eating inventions of economic enclosure of lands and transoceanic ships. And in some ways, a desperate attempt to use these huge weapons of domination for freedom, as can be clearly seen in some first stirrings of air travel notion. Space becomes a sense-making machine by means of nomination, turning imperial conquest and colonization into a possibility of humanizing power relationships. There might be additional general procedures or devices, such as a deviant listing or categorizing of main human relationships under power, the full survey that Lyman Sargent insists upon, but I think these two function by way of the first two, map-making and naming. Thus, utopian texts and utopianism were born as political animals wedded to a possibility of freedom to be negotiated between the individuals and various power currents in the collectivity. True, there were authoritarian utopias galore, most significantly those by Bacon and Campanella, say, and even more oscillated between democracy and patriarchy. But these were particular choices within an epistemologically open horizon. If America exists, all is possible. All kinds of freedom and even a new elite authoritarianism. I have been insisting now for almost half a century that although formally closed, significant utopia is thematically open, and its pointings reflect back on the reader's topia. And I cite Roland Barthes to the effect that the utopian écriture must mobilize at the same time an image and its contrary. All such possible counterworlds are modeled upon our everyday possible world as a unit, or if you wish, totality. However provisional and experimental world. Despite early on being an island or colony, the space and its meaning is always an exemplary counter-project aiming at a different way of human existing. Near the beginning of the best modern survey we have, Jameson's Archaeologies, he writes, "Totality is then precisely this combination of closure and system that presides over the forms of utopian realization, the utopian city, the utopian revolution, the utopian communal village, and of course the utopian text itself. By means of this passion for totality, the utopian impulse blossoms into the utopian alternative project, sprung forth full-blown from the pen of Thomas More. The paradigm can be grasped, Jameson argues, in the qualitative jump from the preliminary sketches of strange countries in Book 1 of Utopia to the radically original totalizing invention of Book 2, never mind how they were written. You know. Quote, Jameson, "The countries in Book 1 are imagined as enclaves within our existent world, whereas despite the positioning and the supplementary explanations, utopia, capital U, is somehow felt to replace our world altogether." Let me disambiguate. Here, total does not mean all exhaustive, though it is a temptation some utopographers succumb to. Nor does it mean that everything is planned from above and violently enforced, as in Mussolini's favorite adjective of totalitarian. Rather, it entails a radically different possible world, that is, a notional totality that for the cognitive purposes of feedback resembles our encyclopedic idea of our world. No image or notion is graspable except as a provisional totality. Yet finally, many major utopian writings are in curious and ingenious ways open-ended totalities. From More's final sentence, you remember, I rather hope than believe, and Bacon's unfinished fragment to, say, the multiplicities of choice in Robinson's Mars trilogy. And I have been worrying at open-endedness since reading Bloch in my dissertation, who tied this concrete utopia to an open system. Modern times, the politics of generic forms. On top of these two aspects, the strategic factor for the readability of modern utopias is their division into subgenres, beginning with a split between utopia and dystopia. Forgive me if I say things which you all know. But this came about under the existential pressure of the division in and after the three main bourgeois revolutions in England, America, and France, between the utopian citoyen phase and the dystopian bourgeois phase of the new rulers. It was recognized by a group of scholars within a theory of literary genres as straddled between humanities and sociology only after the additional shocks of the Russian Revolution and fascism were being digested amid the youth or new left revolts of the 1960s-70s, most notably by Lyman Sargent, Frederick Jameson, and Tom Moylan. The good meaning of utopianism is a presentation, orientation, and striving towards the horizon of radically better forms of relationships among people, an affirmation and annunciation. The bad meaning or dystopianism is a presentation of radically worse forms of relationships, a negation and denunciation. In both cases, what is radically better or worse is judged from the point of view and within the value system of a suffering and discontented social group or fraction as refracted through the writer. This duo of utopia plus dystopia was up to the last decades the main body of utopian writings and horizons, and it is on the whole Jeffersonian, an affirmation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, though it had small but sometimes significant wings to the right and left of such bourgeois democracy. The dystopian possible worlds show up the horrors of human relationships becoming more repressive, exploitative, and alienating. Dystopia as an ideal type is a denunciation and negation of negating utopia. If we follow Sargent, then first of all, anti-utopia as an ideal type is precisely the opposite of both utopia and dystopia, a denunciation and negation of affirming utopian orientation and strivings or dystopian warnings. Anti-utopia is of two kinds, rosy and black, both of which share a switch from politics or history to ontology or nature. No doubt, dystopia so powerful from Zamyatin, Čapek, and US New Deal science fiction on and still alive needs more discussion. However, what I'm now concerned with is to disentangle the generic model of dystopia from that of anti-utopia. What is literary anti-utopia? It is a significantly different locus explicitly designed to refute a currently proposed utopia. It warns against utopias, not, as dystopias do, against the existing status quo. And it perhaps culminated, if that's the word, in Ayn Rand's anthem. Dystopia's mobilizing pessimism shows that the reader should do something about it. Anti-utopia's demobilizing pessimism that nothing should or could be done. The pedigree of anti-utopianism has been little explored, but my hypothesis would be that, except for possible precursors like Aristophanes, it began in ideological horror at the French and similar revolutions, in England by Burke and the conservative romantics. Such reactions in part rightly sensed the dangers of state worship among both capitalists and communists, but then used it to oppose the horizon of human disalienation in the 19th century, and especially after the 1917 Russian Revolution and its fallout, within which utopianism was often wedded to communism or socialism, that is, the welfare state. In terms of literary history and narration, anti-utopianism was mainly confined to two clusters, the anti-Bellamy one in the 1890s and the anti-Leninist one in the 1920s, 30s, reopened from the 1950s on. As a rule, it was poor. The writer and style were less important. Absent were all the usual qualities by which not only Moore or Percy Shelley, but also Wells or Zamyatin or Lem or Le Guin or the Strugatsky brothers were great writers tout court. But second, those qualities had also characterized a thick supporting substratum of a class of considerable secondary writers supplying stimulating ideas, alternatives, and plots, from Jack London, A.T. Wright, Olaf Stapledon, Stanley Weinbaum, Huxley, the US 40s, 50s new maps of hell, and Orwell, to say Brunner, Russ, Mitchison, Kallenbach, Piercy, Dick, Atwood, MacLeod, and you name a dozen other writers. Anti-utopia gets its force outside fiction, from obsessive repetition of its ideological points in all aligned media and think tanks, and from the whip of obscurity and hunger where not drawn liquidation for dissenters. However, I'm concerned with its existential embodiment rather than its narrative form here. The event of existential anti-utopia. Politically and ideologically, anti-utopianism is an embattled adoption of the point of view and value system of globally ruling capitalism and the class or classes bearing it. Anti-utopia is a targeted and openly ideological political use of a closed horizon, not simply to refute or ridicule, but to render unthinkable both the utopia of a better possible world and the dystopia as awful warning about the present tendencies. Thus, to stifle the right to dissent and striving for radical novelty. It is always a political reply to the political project of realizing utopia. The intertext of anti-utopia has historically been anti-socialism and anti-communism, as this was the strongest currently proposed utopia about 1915 to 75, let's say. It is not engaged in radical criticism of the intended readers present, but adapts to it so that its critique, if any, are perfective and amounting to how can we or I profit more. My central socio-formalist and historical thesis is that a world historical novum hit humanity after the end of the Cold War, like the Yucatan comet that extinguished the dinosaurs. In a ruse of history, the ideological political development of capitalism morphed into an encompassing monster, the existential anti-utopia. This is in our scholarship a scandal. In the original biblical sense of a stumbling stone to be disbelieved, for any theory of utopianism worth its oats after about 68 made it crystal clear that utopia is an epistemological and not ontological beast. The argument that an approximation or utopia or even dystopia may be found or constructed in reality, blueprints or colonies, disregarded why they all necessarily fail. We all concluded utopia cannot be realized or not realized. It can only be imagined as a contrast, a fata morgana in the desert of the oppressively real. But history is slyer than any theory yet invented by poor human singletons, and in our stress on values, we should have remembered that axiology also entails finality, telos. So it spills over from epistemology to ontology. We were right to oppose Stalinist and right-wing simplifications by insisting that meaning is conveyed only through forms. Yet I have to acknowledge we were finally wrong, that utopianism cannot have a political embodiment. A powerful approximation to anti-utopia, armed to the teeth, can and is being globally realized by present-day capitalism, its banks, states, and ideologies. All of us now live within a leaden existential global closure where we are threatened by anti-utopia as destiny of subjection within a long-duration collapse of capitalist structures of accumulation. Lehman Brothers, Trump, or Brexit, anyone? This introduces a radical eversion from a situation in which interested readers from outside looked at utopianism as a choice of freedom, an exhilarating possible world, to a situation whereby all of us are willy-nilly inside anti-utopia in our empirical, more and more decaying zero world. This anti-utopian world functions like the mathematized models in capitalist financial speculation, designed to make the model state of affairs more like the model. In it, imaginative understanding is being preempted by myopic and malevolent doing, while our choices are diverted from radical problems to fickle fashion. We are being lived by anti-utopia. This is physically obvious when entire parts of the world are being thrust into destruction by capitalist and or its complementary nationalist armies. And even for the richer enclaves, just so nobody should be spared in the Capitalocene climate change. This changes all, as a wonderful book has for its title, including utopianism, its theory and practice. And our analytical tools have to be adjusted. One guideline: this cannot be done, to my mind, unless accompanied by thorough and explicit analysis speaking against the central features of anti-utopia, that is, today's capitalism sliding into more or less fascism, sexism, racism, terror, ecocide, and perpetual mega-warfare. To use critical dystopias and utopias in order to roll back anti-utopia is a matter of life and death for most of us, possibly for humanity. I will jump to my part 3. This poses an epistemological problem. Since I do not believe in original sin, and especially not in the variant that the devil rules on earth, we have to explain this slide from epistemology to ontology, from a thirst to understanding to a fetishism of the oppressively existing. At stake is, after all, what Ernst Bloch called the principle of hope. I myself wouldn't like to live without hope, let me tell you. Anti-utopia is a constituted absence, my final subchapter, the deeper why. As to our theory of utopianism, we could salvage it by assuming utopia is in anti-utopia latently present as a constituted absence. The sinister hollow is defined by a possible threatening plenitude, as in the constitutive relation between death and life. This is an all-pervasive absence. It determines all defining traits of anti-utopia. Not only the usual fake novums foreclosing radical novums, but also quantity instead of quality, closure instead of openness, fake ontology instead of modest epistemology, point-like inescapability instead of fertile traffic between past, present, and future, monologism instead of contradictoriness, impotent horror instead of intervening hope and indignation, cynicism instead of belief, vertical leadership and horizontal identities instead of polymorphic diversity with recall democracy. Mussolini, Carl Schmitt, and von Mises as great ancestors instead of Rousseau, Stuart Mill, and Marx. Such traits culminate in the subsumptive unholy trinity of anti-utopia: hatred of plebeian creativity and roaming intelligence, the state as repressive violence instead of public power, and annihilating warfare instead of creative emulation. These traits amount to an anti-utopian mythological machine, blending degraded numinosity, power, and commodity aesthetics. It does not aim for truth, but for performativity, a fascistoid effect on corruptible masses. In relation to the light of a disalienated humanity, it is, to cite Milton, no light, but rather darkness visible. It entails a thoroughgoing abolition of free choice on which any worthwhile culture, and within it the system of literature and its genres, reposes from the Renaissance on. As Michel Foucault never tired to argue, neoliberalist governing comports a formidable extension of the control and coercion procedures of the major disciplinary techniques that take in and take care of the individual's everyday behavior up to the smallest detail. The pretense at inclusion of people into power and meaning is in fact a most frustrating exclusion, where the body or naked life is the final and often only capital left. A middle-range local example. The global neoliberalist market imposes its intelligibility grid on all non-economical human affairs, so that whatever cannot be used as human capital and subjected to cost, benefit, and supply-demand criteria becomes simply non-intelligible, irrational, and indeed inhuman, and is ruled out of court by power. Its perfect local complements are the carefully manipulated mini-nationalisms of globalization that mean, most clearly in Africa and Eastern Europe, linguistic unhoming, the deaccession of archives, including their physical destruction, as I gave you in the Croatian example, the eradication of historical memory, internal colonization, a creeping version of Newspeak. So to generalize, the ideal type utopia does not know the categories of profit or servitude. Dystopia shows them as crazy and inhuman. Anti-utopia argues how to get more profit through servitude. Its mantra is, there is no alternative. Its biggest fear is freedom, while hypocritically invoking it in a castrated version. That's to say, elections from the European Parliament, or the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, or whatever, or American presidency. In sum, Marx's profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization, once nakedly visible only in colonies, has now been globalized. Where he identified the reduction of the working day as the prerequisite for the realm of freedom, anti-utopia is a whirling turbine of unceasingly frenzied activities on pain of instant failure. No wonder the German term for our age is Turbokapitalismus. In particular, anti-utopia preempts and enforces denial of marketed fiction's central contact with the reader as not just egalitarian, but constitutive of the storyteller's art itself. The moral of the very act of fabulation was the potential equality of the intelligence in the readers, obviously. Potential. I believe every significant work of art is a kind of truth that opens up both its own possibility and the formal possibility of other possibilities as yet unsuspected by us. Both egalitarianism and possibility are thematized and foregrounded in utopianism's overt appeal to critical reasons. Finally, what about affects? I see in late Capitalocene two opposed main ones. The officially required manic cheer on the road to success is always threatened by the much vaster reservoir of reactive fear, which, when shunted off by the hegemony into the grey matter of subaltern brains, becomes fear for naked survival. At the genetic and structural core of anti-utopia, in my feeling, lies the ruler's fear of plebeian self-empowerment and radical change that is revolution in and around production. The brunt of denial is aimed at the category of revolution and any claim to fertile universality or open-ended totalization. Only the panic, fear, rage, and loathing at the supposed Leninism, communism come to power, can explain the last 40-odd years of finally triumphant capitalism. Its allegorical emblem is the Terminator gene. As you know, it's the gene introduced by megacorporations into seeds to ensure that they cannot be renewed, thus constituting the absence of thousands of years of human crop cultivation, of the utopian horizon of bread for all. Fear, as Bloch began to explain, was the negative affect we share with animals, to which hope, only present in humans, is opposed. Furthermore, hope, says Bloch, allows for logical and concrete correction and sharpening. It is a cognitive, directional act. Today, we seem to me to be blithely returning to the mere animality. Centrally, the whole emancipatory panoply of capitalism's radical bourgeois beginning, from humanist culture and enlightenment through revolutions and romanticism, is being ruthlessly and systematically scrapped, up to the shark-like liquidation of traces of welfare for the people. As Marx piercingly observed, when events force upon the bourgeoisie a democratic constitution, this helps the proletariat and threatens the very foundations of bourgeois society. To give you one weighty example, the abolition of torture, the favorite feudal and church tool against rebelling lower classes, was the crown jewel of enlightenment and bourgeois liberalism. It is now taken back. Rewinding history, the rights of the revolutionary and democratic citoyen or citizen are being thoroughly expunged. The result is the relentless deepening and broadening of what Fanon called the zone of non-being for the racialized and colonialized subject, but only for all of us. As Le Guin's protagonist in The Dispossessed, to my mind the best piece of utopian writing since Wells, if not Moore and Swift, tells the ambassador from a totally anti-utopian terra, and I quote, "You would destroy us rather than admit our reality, rather than admit that there is hope," unquote. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Darko for asking me to act as his respondent, and I promise you all that I will be short, as I'm sure you have plenty of questions for him. And it was not an easy task to write these few notes, partly because I pretty much agree with most of what you said. So what I'm trying to do today is just to offer a couple of thoughts to continue the conversation, and you can decide which one to address and skip the others. So you divided your talk into two parts. The first section explores where we are in today's Capitalocene and what we're doing wrong, identifying in war and ecocide two of the pillars of capitalism, whereas in the second section, you gave us an equally passionate discussion of existential anti-utopia. And the first thing that that I want to say is that you open your talk with an important acknowledgement, I think, of Angelica Bammer's revised edition of Partial Vision and her quote from Adrian Rich. And I'm really glad that you started with that. I think it's very important that you decided to open your talk with an acknowledgement to the contribution of feminism to the fight against capitalism and for the creation of a better society. In the past days, we have heard, among others, Darren Webb stating that there is no solution that leaves capitalism intact. And I would like to add that there is no solution and revolution that leaves women out and that leaves also patriarchy intact. Okay? I'm sure that nobody needs to be reminded that women constitute 80% of the climate refugees today. My second point has to do with the role of Europe today in the climate change issue. I know that this is very pragmatic. I mean, any talk about Europe. But when you discuss ecocide, you quoted a couple of UN reports, and I would just like to add that the EU is also involved in this fight, and that today's European guidelines for sustainability center on climate change, inclusion, and the redefinition of democracy, showing a link between capitalism and inequalities. And, you know, I'm well aware of the complexities related to any discourse on Europe, but I think that it's still important to recognize Europe today, for me as an Italian, but I think also for people from other countries, including most obviously the United Kingdom, for example, because of the violent attacks against Europe by the new sovereignist government, of which, unfortunately, Italy is part. I found two other points very interesting. One is the crucial relationship between utopian ideology, a sort of ongoing problem, unresolved and perhaps unsolvable. It seems to me that you're saying that utopia cannot be a neutral place. But this problem informs, I think, also your subsequent discussion of anti-utopia. And it comes down to the position from which you receive and produce culture. And I will return to this when I talk about your section on anti-utopia. The second point I found fascinating regards your claim that we cannot separate the artists with their ideas from their works of art. And I would like to ask, where does one draw the line between ethics and aesthetics? You give the example of Pound and his poetry. You gave the example of the Pisancantos, which I think are brilliant, you know, while I also admire Pound's work, not necessarily Pound the person. But I could also add the example, for example, of John Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Chinua Achebe's question whether a racist book can be considered a masterpiece. In your second part on anti-utopia, I find myself most in agreement with what you say, so I can only, again, extrapolate some points that I liked in particular and found stimulating, starting with your tweaking apart, that the utopian literature must mobilize at the same time an image and its contrary, and in so doing, it opens up a space for a critical assessment of the present. You then move on to state that no image or notion is graspable except as a provisional totality, a totality that is nonetheless open-ended. So if I understand, you're saying that we're all able to understand the world only as totality, and I'm kind of asking, is it really like that? Is it only like that? Do we experience it, though, differently? To get back to the problem of utopian ideology, I would translate your notion of anti-utopia into a false or fake utopia, not to give it a new name, but just a... So the anti-utopia of capitalism, the concrete anti-utopia of today, or the fake utopia of today, is nonetheless a utopia for someone. So the two fundamental questions that I think that you're implying without stating them, but that I think we should all remember when we talk about utopia, are utopian for whom and at what cost. So when you differentiate between the effects produced on readers by dystopia and anti-utopia, it seems to me that you're saying that anti-utopia does not lead readers to criticize their own world, whereas dystopia still mobilizes the readers and tells them that something could and should be done. But again, doesn't this depend on where one is speaking from? And wouldn't one recognize it as an anti-utopia or a utopia depending on his or her ideology? Couple final points. I understand, obviously, that you cannot cover everything in 50 minutes, so you didn't have time to talk more about the narrative form of the anti-utopia. But in the section that you cut, but we have, on the method, you say that existential embodiment and narrative form should not be separated, and so I wonder if you could say something more. I think so.
Can you show it?
Oh, I can find it later. Okay. And
No method.
I think it's in the method.
It's in the method, yeah, if any.
Okay. And then also when you say that our analytic tools have to be adjusted to this victory of ideology over utopia, again, I share and appreciate your statement that utopias and critical dystopias are still relevant and important in order, as you say, to roll back anti-utopia. But I was wondering if you could, could say something more about this. And my very, very last observation has to do with your use of terms like global and glocal, whereas I don't think, or at least I search, and I think you use the term globalization only once. And so I'm asking if the Capitalocene is it equal to globalization? And is there anything good in a globalized world? Thanks.
Am I supposed to answer this? Well, first of all, I'm extremely culpable because I forgot at the beginning in my concentration on egotistic concentration on my own work, I forgot to thank Andrew Milner, which I do now, and the Society of Utopian Studies for having me here. It was an unexpected pleasure and has remained such. I don't want to get into a discussion of Europe. I personally think Europe as existing today must be destroyed. And I think so ever since Greece capitulated to Europe. That was the last straw. We could have had debates before that, but obviously without destroying the political bureaucracy in Brussels, you cannot do anything in your own country. Of course, who could be against the idea of Europe, not having war on the Rhine? Who can be against that? That's not what this Europe does. I mean, that has been ruled out of court by the great corporations, because by now German and French capital is so intertwined that they would be crazy to shoot themselves in the foot to have a war on the Rhine. So I don't want to get into this. Personally, my reaction to a grave wound is a grave cauterizing, so to speak, as any good surgeon would tell you. I don't like the word of ideology. I use it because I don't know what to do without it. But it can either mean this damn thing which you do but I hate, or any form or system of ideas that anybody neutrally uses. Obviously, the number one excludes the number two, and vice versa. So it's a semantically impure tool, okay? And even more so is the ethics versus aesthetics business. It's so polluted, you know, like the Erie Canal. I mean, The Pisan cantos have a section on usura, which is the medieval name for capitalism, is when you get return from dead matter, money, you get offspring, profit, percentages. The section against usura is an anti-capitalist section. First of all, it's well written. It's rhythmical, it's phonetical, it's blah, 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 everything that a poem should be. I mean, it is not quite by accident that the greatest poet of modernism, who is T.S. Eliot, called Ezra Pound il miglior fabbro. Okay. Everybody who writes poetry, I do so in my modest ways, knows that half of what you write is not going to survive 12 months. Okay. And then another quarter is not going to survive 36 months, and so on, you know. But the best of people like Eliot or Pound is there. Pound also was a left-wing fascist. That's to say the people Hitler killed off in 1934 and Mussolini didn't quite kill off but kicked out of office a bit later, okay? Who really believed, poor stupid guy, that fascism was anti-capitalist, okay? And was going to introduce social justice and give workers a voice and blah, blah, and blah, blah. So you can only say he was illiterate politico-economically, as all the left fascists were, but he was interesting. I mean, there's a whole book in French by Fay on left fascism, if you're into, very old book, and much since. Jünger was the same. Jünger was not an essay, but he was a great ancestor. You know, Ernst Jünger, the great on Marble Cliffs, is considerable work, and his earlier work on World War and on the worker is considerable stuff, okay? We can disagree, I disagree with his basis and his horizon, but, you know. So I'm not interested in ethics and aesthetics, and I'm not interested in the personality of Ezra Pound. I knew a friend of Ezra Pound, his name was Jim Blish, and he was a science fiction writer. And he called himself a fascist, okay? He was my friend. I said, Jim, you have, because he hated the USA. Therefore, he wanted to be fascist. And he moved out of the USA and lived in Maidenhead-on-the-Thames in England and visited Ezra Pound's daughter, Countess von Rachelwitz, in her castle in Trento, in the Trento region, using his scant reserves of American Express indebtment. I said, you have no idea, Jim, what fascism is. You never lived under it. I did. What he meant was anti-capitalism, okay? I have no interest at all in Ezra Pound's psychology. That's the matter for his daughter and his friend Jim Blish. That's not my interest. I have no interest in Joseph Conrad's Polish roots, post-Catholic, blah, blah, blah. My interest is, what does Heart of Darkness do to the readers? Okay? The rest is individualist nonsense, I think. If somebody's a psychologist or a sociologist, let them go and investigate it. I mean, is there a capitalist utopia? I think there's a wonderful passage in Ruth Levitas where she says, all this looseness and openness is too much for me. This is too much for me. There is no capitalist utopia if you have a value system at all. If you don't want to acknowledge that there is a value system in the world, then you can say anything you want because you are irresponsible and you don't answer to anybody. If capitalism has a collective horizon that pretends to utopia, that is fascism, remember, is Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. That was the name of the Nazi party, National Socialist German Workers' Party. At least half of the original members really believed that. Okay? Many unemployed workers were Nazi members. The employed ones were not. The unemployed were, because they were desperate. okay? And employed ones had trade unions that didn't care about the unemployed very intelligently. Both socialists and communists, by the way. That is just a matter of intelligence, not how far on the left you are. If capitalism has a personal utopia, as Ernst Bloch thinks, Don Giovanni, for example, erotic, I think he's wrong. I think his essay on Don Giovanni is wonderful. I don't think it should be in a book on utopia. Okay? If utopia is everything in the world, then utopia equals reality. Then we talk about reality, existence, or ontology, and we don't need the term utopia. Please go away, go home, and talk about reality. There is no utopian society, okay? So that is my beef against my great teacher, whom I revere, and I'm very sorry to see backgrounded Ernst Bloch. Okay. What else did you ask me?
I don't know. About globalization, I suppose.
Well, globalization, well, I mean, all the sparrows on all the roofs were talking about globalization ever since 1980 or whatever. Okay, what is globalization? I once wrote a semantic analysis of globalization. Globalization is the term that replaces internationalism on the left, okay? It's the capitalist world for corporative domination of the globe, which means instant transfer of capital, difficult transfer of people, only when we want it and insofar as we want workers, okay? Roughly. Instant transfer of capital, easier but horribly complicated and wasteful transfer of commodities, you know, where in order to build a machine you have to take one piece from Chile and one piece from Russia, and, you know, and you have to transport them in order to make a profit, right? I have nothing to add to this globalization. Why should we talk about globalization today? I have no idea. I talk about Capitalocene. Why do I talk about Capitalocene? I thought, I was very deluded. I thought I had invented it. I found out that Jason Moore has invented it. I didn't know it. I didn't know it. I'm sorry, I'm a pensioner without university library. And I read things 1 or 2 years later when I have money to go to Cambridge or Uppsala and sit a month in a library, you know. So I didn't know about Jason Moore. I read about Jason Moore in China Mieville. But he is quite right. I mean, China Mieville's ending, I think, is very bad. What should we do about it? But everything up to the ending is wonderful, and I sign it, you know, totally. It implies that we here are responsible for the destruction of the climate and all other ills of the world. We are unwilling participants, yes, because you cannot not breathe. You cannot not drive to Prato if you want to get to Prato or get an airplane to Prato, okay? But we are unwilling, we are forced into it, we have no choice. The people who have the choice are our masters, that Kipling nicely called the powers that be. Okay, they have the choice and they have the moral responsibility. We have a part of the responsibility insofar as we don't stop them. Okay, but that's easier said than done. Then you must organize into movements and parties and blah, 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 blah. Is capital, first of all, you know, Brecht wrote in 1944 a hexameter version of the Communist Manifesto, which I have translated into English, if anybody is interested, 405 hexameters, which is difficult. A hexameter in English is difficult. His friend Feuchtwanger participated in this and pulled out after 2 or 3 weeks and said, there is no way you can put proletariat into a hexameter, you know, which Brecht solved very simply. He called them Arbeiter, you know, workers. I mean, so is Capitalocene a nice word? No, it's an ugly word. Its stresses are horrible, and so on. But is it more cognitively useful than Anthropocene? Well, about 750 times, in my opinion. Okay? Anthropocene was pretty good when it was invented, all right? But it's not enough. It's just like, you know, when you are a child, you have these swaddling clothes. What is it called that the child walks in? The system of textile that you have to lead him. No, when he's walking, I forget. Anyway, I think it's a cop-out. Anthropocene is a cop-out. If we are all responsible, then nobody's responsible, you know. I mean, Donald Trump is just as responsible as Rafaella Baccolini. Excuse me? Well, it just seems idiotic to think that way. I'm sorry. No, anybody. I speak by examples, Sorin. You should know that after all this time. An exemplum is a special thing that has universal significance. Okay. Okay, I think that's enough.
Yes.
That's quite enough.
Thank you very much, both of you.